Hi, Art 109 students, calling here to give our Unit 3 lecture. We're going to be focusing on the American artist Amy Sherald, who is well known for her portraiture. So we're going to begin by looking at the history of portrait painting. We're going to look at some historical examples of women artists who use portraiture, and then we'll get into Amy Sherald's work. You should begin this lecture by watching 2 videos that are posted on our Blackboard course shell page. And then we're going to get a little bit more into some information in this video, and we'll pause one more time to watch a couple more. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So in the video, we got a sense of what portraiture means, to show a likeness, and began to become more popular in art, particularly in painting around the 13th century. It was very popular during the Renaissance, which is an art movement you've probably heard of before. The Mona Lisa by Da Vinci is an example of a Renaissance portrait from the 15th century. And we start to see portraiture during this time become a tool for memorializing people, particularly those who had wealth, right? Because you had to have a lot of money to pay an artist to paint your portrait. And it also was a status symbol of power. So we would see portraits of kings and queens and palaces. We would see portraits of a family that might be wealthy to show off their wealth in their homes. And we began to see this as a tool. So artists are making a lot of money during this time because all of these wealthy and powerful people are wanting to get portraits of themselves. We also start to slowly see throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, as we move from Renaissance to the Baroque art period, we begin to see portraiture not only being imagery of those who are wealthy and powerful, but we also see portraiture as a way to elevate those who are famous, those who are elevated to a stature in which we respect. So we see imagery that comes up from the Bible and more Eurocentric Western perspectives. We see stories that are beginning to be told. And as we start to get into the 18th and 19th centuries, around the period of Impressionism and then Post-Impressionism, we begin to see portraits aren't just to represent the wealthy and powerful, but rather portraits are for anyone. We are beginning to paint portraits of folks who are out and about in their everyday lives. And this is due to a huge change that happened as the forefront of photography begins to develop. Now, all of a sudden, those who are wealthy and powerful can get their photo taken, which is a huge deal. It's a huge shift. So we start to see less of a trend of using painting as a way to capture someone's portrait, but rather we see photography. Photography also made it more accessible to do portraiture for anyone who can afford to get a photo taken. So you could control the narrative of your story. And if you didn't have enough money to hire a painter to paint your portrait, you certainly probably had enough money to pay for a photograph of yourself, which is a big deal to be able to take control of the narrative of representing your identity. And we're going to talk more about that with Amy Sherald's work in just a while. So we're going to begin by looking at some historical examples of female artists who use portraiture in their work. And particularly, we're going to begin with a more Western Eurocentric perspective, which I know in this class we're trying to get away of, but I'm going to begin with that because this particular artist is probably the most famous woman portrait artist throughout history. And this is Artemisia Gentileschi, who was born in Rome, and she was a famous painter during the Baroque era of the 17th century. So this happened again right after the Renaissance. And a key characteristic of the Baroque era is that paintings begin to show a little bit more drama. It shows drama through stark and strong lighting. It shows drama through drapery, through lots of added adornments and imagery. And Gentileschi definitely takes advantage of this in her paintings. And she comes from a more sort of wealthy background and worked with a lot of people within the highest echelons, people of power within European society. She even worked for the Grand Duke of Tuscany. She worked for Philip IV of Spain. And this was due to the fact that she happened to be the daughter of a famous painter. So during this time period in Europe in the 17th century, women could not study at the academy. So the academy is where most male artists were learning to paint. And that's because she was a woman. She wasn't allowed to go there. So she learned to paint through her father, serving as an apprentice in his studio. And she would have never become a painter or been able to do that without that privilege of having a father who was a painter. But she found very early on in her career that it was not easy for her to make it as a painter because she couldn't even visit a lot of the places where painters would have to go paint commissions. So churches and public buildings, and even inside people's homes to do a portrait sometimes was not okay due to the fact that she was a woman. So she took a lot of her focus then on showing imagery from different stories and narratives, particularly of the Bible. Here we have an example of Judith and her maidservant with the head of Holofernes, which is a story from the Bible. And she starts to develop a style in which the way that she paints, particularly women, is very dramatic, right? It's that key characteristic of the Baroque art period. Things are bright light on their faces, lots of drapery, lots of adornment through the prints on the fabric. A lot of times the background is very dark and black, allowing the figures to jump out into the foreground. And in this way that she is painting women is empowering them, giving them a force, giving them a way to show why they became such key characters in these stories from the Bible. And she's even quoted as once saying to one of her patrons who is paying for a portrait that you will find the spirit of Caesar in the soul of a woman. So she was very aware of the fact that she was empowering women through the way that she painted them in this way of liberation. So one other artist I'd like to show you that is not a more Western Eurocentric perspective, but rather we're going to get a little bit more into Asia, is Georgette Chen. And she was born in China. She did study in a Eurocentric perspective. So she did study under academics in Paris and in New York, but then she ended up living in Singapore for the rest of her life. And she's widely recognized for her contributions as both a portrait artist, and then she also painted a lot of scenes from everyday life, and particularly within Singapore, which is where she ended up becoming a painting teacher. And I also want to point out here that I have jumped in time, right? So we just went from 17th century to the 20th century. So this is a big jump. I just went a couple decades into the future. And that's because I want to get more into the context of Amy Sherald's work. But back to Georgette Chen. So she was certainly at the forefront of painting in Singapore at this time. She starts to develop a style that is more modern. And it's modern because she begins to not make everything look so dramatic through this representation of realism, where instead she's using a little bit of abstraction. She's using more of like a post-impressionist style where she's taking her painting and her paint strokes are going to have a little bit more texture to them. They're going to have a little bit more curvular, organic feel to them. So it's not just straight up realism, right? We have a little bit of abstraction here. And that abstraction starts to begin to set a tone for the painting itself. So that's what kind of gets her to be a little bit more famous during this period, is that she's kind of changing up the style of portraiture. She's using a lot of stark outlines, which is also a huge key characteristic of her style. And she starts to begin to depict more scenes of everyday life. So like I mentioned before, after the video, we start to see in the early 1900s more of a shift of portraiture that goes from this sort of power symbol of wealth and power, but rather more of just using portraiture to capture what is going on in the artist's life or the people in which they choose to depict. So now we're going to look at Frida Kahlo, who is a Mexican artist who pushes that idea of everyday life in portraiture even more. And she does so through abstraction. So she is taking representation, which is going to depict something that looks realistic, and she is shifting it to the point where it becomes fantasy. And she's very much inspired by surrealism, which is an art movement that became famous in France and started to sort of spread throughout Europe into the Americas and eventually down to South America, where Frida Kahlo was from. So she was very aware of European art movements. She studied as an artist in art school and has that history, that contextual history. So she knows about the history of portraiture. She knows about the history of using portraiture as a status symbol. She knows about the religious symbolism. Even in this painting here, she's making some references to the Catholic Church and Catholicism through the veil that she is wearing. And she's taking it and then she's using it through surrealism, through a surrealistic lens of fantasy to talk about her own personal identity and things that are going on in her life. She had a very turbulent life. She began painting actually after a severe accident that devastated her body. And she was in bed for a really long time as a sort of like during her college years. And she began painting on the cast that covered her body that she was in bed. And from then on, she wanted to study as an academic. And she looked for the sort of proper academic setting that she wanted. And she discovered the artist Diego Rivera, who was a famous painter at the time. He was a communist and was well known for his large mural paintings in Mexico that were sort of used as communist propaganda to send messages around this idea of communism. And because he was so famous at the time, Frida Kahlo really wanted to study under him. They ended up falling in love, they got married, but their marriage from the beginning was very fraught, very stressful. And a lot of the works that she does from this time depicts Diego Rivera and sort of talks about the tension within the relationship. He had had an affair with her sister, things got really turbulent. And this painting is taking the history of portraiture as a sort of status symbol, turning it around into this surrealistic perspective of fantasy to talk about the tension between her and Diego Rivera at the time. We also see Frida Kahlo using portraiture to talk about her past and her history and her culture. So her herself, there's a photograph here, a portrait photograph here on the right-hand side, showing her dressed in this sort of Mexican persona that she often was in. She often took the indigenous background of her pre-Columbian history and used jewelry and adornment and flowers in her hair and the way that she dressed to really bring about that identity that was really important to her. And to show that in her painting was also a priority. So here in this painting that she did called My Grandparents, My Parents, and I, we can see this, again, a very surrealistic fantasy-based painting that is showing this history of her as a young little girl and then kind of going up into her ancestry. So definitely using this idea of identity, but taking it further through the surrealistic perspective. Another portraiture artist at the time who was both Hungarian and Indian is Amerta Shergill, and she also is well known for developing a more modern style of portrait painting. So we looked at Jin's work, who was from China and growing up in Singapore. She used a lot of those outlines and sort of dramatic colors. Amerta Shergill is doing the same thing. She's really starting to take a little bit of abstraction to show a sense of mood and color in her paintings, and also showing paintings of just people in their everyday lives. So this, even though this woman does look very lavish with her sort of beautiful outfit that she was wearing, she really is just painting pictures of young girls, pictures of women who are, or of young girls who are coming into womanhood. And that was a really key sort of portrait focus that she had throughout her career. And she's considered one of the most important painters of the 20th century in India. And mostly that's because she stuck to more sort of pre-colonial styles as well. So even though she was seen as this modern artist, she definitely took her style from pre-colonial Indian art. So she kind of marries the two, and that's what made her stand out as well. Okay, so now we're going to dig a little bit deeper in looking at some Black portrait painters from America to show the sort of context for Amy Sherald's work. And these two artists that we're going to look at now both lived and worked in the United States, particularly in larger cities, and used portraiture to capture scenes of everyday life. The first artist we're going to look at is Laura Wheeler Waring. She was born in Hartford, Connecticut in this very upper class family. So she had a background where she trained formally as both an artist and a musician. And she has a very long time career of painting portraiture, particularly focusing on famous people, which I'll get into in just a moment. So here we can see on the left-hand side are two portraits of people who are key sort of participants of the Harlem Renaissance. And so we've got Woman with a Bouquet, which is this woman who you may find from the street in Harlem in New York City. She's wearing this beautiful dress, beautiful jewelry, and she's wanting to capture the essence of that time period. She also has a portrait here of W.E.B. Du Bois. And during her lifetime, Laura Wheeler Waring was often criticized for painting these famous people from the Harlem Renaissance, saying that she is an elitist in the way that she is only painting portraits of those who are famous. When I would definitely counteract that argument and say that there is nothing wrong with painting portrait of powerful Black people from this time period. The Harlem Renaissance is a very important time in history that often, though you may have heard of it, it often gets overlooked when we're learning about history. And a lot of these key characters who were famous at the time are also overlooked in history. So really what she is doing is capturing history at its forefront. And she also did paint portraits of ordinary people. Here on the right-hand side, we have these two portraits of people who are not famous and, were just probably commissions or something that she chose to do on her own. One other example here, we have another portrait of Marian Anderson, who is another key factor of the Harlem Renaissance. And we see these sort of commissions, we see her style begins to change. If we go from here to here, we start to see a little bit more of the mark making of the painting starting to show. We start to see a transition, and she often would change her style based off the type of portrait that she was doing. And then another portrait of another famous Black artist, Alma Thomas. So she would also paint portraits of her contemporaries. The second artist that we're going to look at is Lois Mailou Jones, who is a very well-traveled artist. So she has this history of traveling during her academic years when she was formally training as an artist, which really has a huge influence on her style. So we can see that, let's see, I just want to read over a little bit about so she has this European influence because she did study in places like Paris and Italy, but she also spent a lot of time studying in Africa, which had a great impact on her work. And during the time, and actually the more kind of random way that she got into looking at African art was that she was studying in Paris. And in Paris at the time, in the early 1920s, we started to see a lot of white artists appropriate African styles, which is very problematic. And she started to notice of this. And she said, I am a Black woman. I am an African American. I should be the one who can go to look at African imagery in my painting. And she did just that. So we see a huge influence in her work from that sort of kind of weird dynamic history of studying in this Eurocentric way, but also kind of trying to embrace her ancestry and her history. So here's an example of a painting from that time period where she is starting to get influenced by a focus. And here we have an example from Liberia of this sort of imagery that she is appropriating from that culture in her own style of portraiture. And she even eventually was commissioned by the United States to be a cultural ambassador to Africa. So we can see throughout her entire career imagery that is inspired by her time within these 11 countries in which she was an ambassador. But after her time, working as an ambassador, she also wanted to focus on the everyday lives of African Americans. After returning from her studies in Europe and also her time during the ambassador, she also at the same time was just painting portraits from everyday life or painting portraits that elevated Black people, that show them they are ordinary citizens living their everyday lives, which is not a common subject that we would see in portraiture, which I'll get into a little bit more when I talk about Amy Sherald's work. But she wanted to show people with dignity and respect. So even in this very stark painting on the left called Moth Victim Meditation, she is still showing the man who is going through this terrible experience in an elevated way. He is looking up, right? He is overcoming the injustice that is happening up against him. He has light shining on him. He is focusing on something that is higher than him, perhaps a higher power. So we could see this in a religious sense. And then on the right-hand side, we see just an ordinary day, right? We see a woman who is cleaning a fish in preparation for a meal. And again, highlighting the fact that we are seeing Black folks who are living in America in the same way that we might see a white person depicted in a painting. Again, we'll talk more about that with Amy Sherald's work. So one last image from Louis Melu Jones of the young man in a red sweater. And again, we can see a big style change too, where her works kind of go from this more kind of crisp and spunky, modern, even pop art like style, to a more impressionist style here, to an even more impressionist style here, where we're using really bold paint mark making to the point where she's not really rendering anything too far. She's not really focused too much on her gradation or value. Instead, she's really just trying to capture the essence of the man.